My life was always going up, my business was going uphill. But at some point, everything collapsed and lost all meaning. The trip I had been waiting for turned into a real nightmare when my wife met her old friend in one of the hotels, and their meeting ruined my life. I'm ready to share my story and how I handled it all. Enjoy watching. I never thought my life would resemble the script of a cheap soap opera. Nicholas Morgan, 32 years old, a successful programmer, owner of a luxurious house in Nevada, and a brand new BMW car. That's my profile. I've always considered control to be my second language. Planning, discipline, precision. These are my faithful companions on the road to success. But I won't lie. I've always enjoyed boasting about my achievements to my friends. After all, what could be better than admitting that you've made it on your own? My wife, Tiffany, has always been my best trophy. A 28-year-old blonde with voluptuous curves who could drive anyone crazy with her mere presence. We met at a party through a mutual acquaintance, and we've been inseparable since then. 4 years of marriage felt like a fairy tale to me. She didn't want children, claiming that it would ruin her figure, and I agreed. After all, kids weren't a priority for me. I had enough with her smile, and her attention. I loved Tiffany immensely and always aimed to fulfill her every whim. Freedom. That's what I cherished in our relationship. Perhaps too much. We lived in Nevada, where I worked for one of the leading IT companies. My job required a lot of time and effort, but I never complained. I loved what I did, and I knew my job not only brought satisfaction, but also provided enough means for a luxurious life for Tiffany and me. But even in the world of digits and codes, you need to take a break sometimes. So, one day coming back home, I decided to surprise Tiffany by offering her a trip to Hawaii. Islands, the ocean, sun, the perfect place to relax and forget about work, at least for a while.
We haven't been anywhere for so long,
she said, laughing and hugging me.
You know I can't resist a beach and cocktails.
Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and at that moment I felt like the happiest person on earth. We planned our trip, discussed the details, and the places we wanted to visit. I took time off from work, and 2 weeks later we were already on a plane heading for new adventures. Arriving in Honolulu felt like stepping into paradise. The outrigger reef on the beach hotel amazed us with its beauty and comfort. An ocean view room, a pool, excellent services. Everything was perfect. We savored every moment. Massages, swimming in the ocean, evening walks along the shore. Everything seemed so wonderful, so carefree. But little did I know that this paradise would turn into my personal hell in an instant. The first days in Hawaii felt like a dream. It was as if I had crossed into another world where time slowed down, and my problems were left behind on the mainland. Tiffany was happy, and her happiness made me happy. Every morning we woke up to the warm rays of the sun, streaming through the curtains of our room overlooking the ocean. Breakfasts on the veranda, the sound of waves and singing birds all created an atmosphere of complete serenity. We spent our days exploring the island. Oahu's beaches resembled paradise scenes from magazines. Pristine white sand, azure waves, and incredibly vivid sunsets. We swam in the ocean, sunbathed, and simply enjoyed each other's company. In the evenings, we dined at cozy restaurants, savoring local dishes. It felt like a second honeymoon. For a moment, I even forgot about my work and my constant urge to control everything around me. However, this tranquility was deceptive. One evening, after dinner, we entered the hotel's bar. I ordered cocktails for both of us, and that's when my attention was drawn to the bartender. A young man with a gentle smile and attentive eyes. He introduced himself as Brandon. His gaze at Tiffany was not just polite. It conveyed something more. I saw how she responded with a look full of interest. In that moment, I felt a little tense, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just fatigue from the day in the sun. At night, lying in bed, I thought about Tiffany and Brandon. There was something about their interaction that made me uneasy. But I quickly dismissed those thoughts. Tiffany was my wife, and I trusted her. We were happy together, so why should I worry about some bartender? The next day, we spent time at the beach. I noticed Tiffany occasionally glancing towards the bar where Brandon worked. I tried to convince myself that they were just random glances, but somewhere deep inside, doubt crept in. In the evening, we visited the bar again. This time, I watched them more closely. It was evident that some kind of connection had developed between them. I saw them laughing and joking, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. That night, I decided to talk to Tiffany. I asked her if she knew Brandon. She looked surprised and laughed.
Of course not,
she said.
He's just a friendly bartender. Are you jealous?
No, of course not.
I replied, trying to hide my unease. But deep down, I felt that something was amiss. However, I decided not to dwell on these thoughts. We were on vacation, on a paradise island. I didn't want to ruin our trip with silly doubts. With each passing day in Hawaii, I could feel the world around me starting to crumble. It all started innocently enough, chance encounters at the bar, casual conversations with the bartender. But my intuition told me something was off. Tiffany acted differently when he was around. Her looks, her smiles. I began to have doubts. One evening, as I sat in the bar watching them, Brandon cracked a joke, and Tiffany burst into laughter. The sound of her laughter made me uncomfortable. It seemed like it wasn't meant for me. That's when I decided to take a decisive step.
Tiffany,
I began when we returned to our room.
have you ever seen Brandon before our trip?
She looked at me surprised. Then her gaze became more contemplative.
Well, yes.
She admitted.
He was my first boyfriend, but it was a long time ago, before you. We coincidentally met here in Hawaii. It's just a coincidence, Nicholas.
The world inside me shook. Her first boyfriend? A coincidence? Why hadn't she told me about this before? It was hard for me to believe that all of this was just a coincidence. I tried to hide my anxiety, but I felt my trust in Tiffany starting to crack.
Why didn't you tell me about this earlier?
I asked, trying to remain calm.
I didn't think it was important.
She replied.
We broke up many years ago. It was before you, Nicholas. You shouldn't worry.
But I was worried. Deep down, I began to doubt her words and her feelings towards me. These doubts slowly eroded my confidence and faith in our love. The following days were filled with anxiety. I tried to convince myself that my fears were just the product of my imagination. But now that I knew about their past, every interaction between them seemed suspicious to me. One evening, when Tiffany went to the bar before me, I decided to follow her. Standing in the shadows, I watched them. They were talking about something, and their faces were so close. At that moment, I felt my heart freeze. I wanted to scream, to shatter that moment, but I restrained myself. I had to be sure. I had to know the truth. Returning to our room, I lay down in bed, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. My thoughts were filled with doubts and suspicions. I began to wonder if Tiffany had cheated on me. I felt my heart fill with pain and anger. That night was the longest of my life. I lay in the darkness, listening to Tiffany's quiet breathing and feeling the world around me change. I knew that everything would change tomorrow. I had to find out the truth, but I couldn't even imagine the cost. At dawn, I couldn't sit still any longer. I had to do something. After breakfast, Tiffany said she wanted to spend time by the pool. I agreed, but soon found a convenient spot from where I could observe her in the bar. Time moved slowly. Every minute felt like an eternity. I saw Tiffany and Brandon exchanging glances, smiling at each other. My heart ached. By evening, my state had reached its limit. I felt exhausted, as if my feelings and emotions were draining all my strength. Tiffany said she was tired and wanted to go to bed early. I nodded, pretending to agree, and told her that I wanted to spend a couple of hours at the bar to relax. To my surprise, Tiffany didn't react at all and simply went back to our room, leaving me sitting there alone. I sat there, lost in my thoughts, until I noticed that Brandon was finishing his shift, and another bartender took his place. My mind was overflowing with suspicion. From my table, I watched as he left the bar and headed to the hotel toward our room. My heart stopped. I followed him, trying not to attract attention. As I approached our room, I couldn't hear anything. I slowly opened the door, trying to remain calm. Entering the room, it was empty, but I saw Brandon's scattered belongings on the floor. They were Brandon's things, and suddenly I heard loud noises coming from the bathroom. As I got closer, I heard moans, and I couldn't mistake them for anyone else's. They were my wife's moans. I felt something inside me snap. Anger and betrayal filled me. In that moment, I lost control of myself. I grabbed the first thing I could find. It was the toilet brush. I first kicked Brandon off his feet and then delivered a second blow with the brush to his head. He fell to the floor, unconscious. Tiffany screamed when she saw what had happened. Her face was filled with shock and fear. She tried to say something, but I couldn't listen. I was filled with anger and disappointment.
How could you?
I yelled at her.
I trusted you. I loved you.
She tried to explain, tried to apologize, but her words felt empty to me. At that moment, I realized it was all over. Everything I knew and loved had been shattered. Leaving the room, I felt like I was in a daze. My world, which had seemed perfect just yesterday, had crumbled, leaving behind only shards of pain and betrayal. I walked through the hotel's corridors, but my thoughts were far away. I felt a storm raging inside me, now mixed with a sense of emptiness and despair. I found myself on the street, not even remembering how I got there. The Hawaiian night enveloped me with its warmth, but all I felt was the coldness in my heart. I walked aimlessly past brightly lit shop windows and bustling restaurants. Images of what had just happened kept flashing in my mind. Tiffany and Brandon standing in a compromising position in the bathroom, their faces full of surprise and fear when I burst in. These images haunted me, giving me no peace. I realized I couldn't just leave and let everything be. I had to take action. Returning to the hotel, I gathered my belongings from the room, trying not to look at Brandon, who was still unconscious on the floor. Tiffany cried, begging me to stay, but I couldn't. I took her phone and documents, locked them in the room, and left without looking back. On the way to the airport, I felt my determination growing inside me. I was resolute in ending this as soon as possible. On the plane, I tried to plan my next steps. I had to protect myself and my interests. I couldn't let Tiffany get away with what she had done to me. Upon landing in Nevada, I felt exhausted, but my intentions remained unchanged. First, I visited the bank to freeze our joint accounts. Every keystroke in the bank system felt like a step towards the final break with Tiffany. I couldn't allow her to use my resources after betraying me in such a way. Then I called my lawyer to initiate the divorce process. My voice sounded cold and determined as I described the situation and my demands. I wanted to ensure that the divorce would proceed quickly and without unnecessary emotions. Upon returning home, I immediately began changing the locks. Every turn of the key felt like a definitive sign that my marriage with Tiffany was over. This was my home, and now there was no place for betrayal. Late in the evening, overwhelmed by fatigue but still weighed down by the events of the past few days, I sat down at the computer. Hacking Tiffany's social media accounts was an easy task for me as a programmer. I posted some compromising photos and messages there, intending to damage her reputation. I knew it was petty revenge, but it seemed like the only thing I could do to inflict any kind of harm. As I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself that what I had done was right. However, deep down, I felt that my revenge hadn't brought me any relief. Instead, it added to the weight of my inner burden. My actions were driven by anger and pain, but they couldn't bring back the world I had lost. That night in my home felt long and sleepless. In the silence of my rooms, I felt even more alone. My thoughts kept returning to the happy moments Tiffany and I had shared before everything fell apart. Now those memories seemed distant and foreign to me. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about how my life would never be the same as it once was. I realized that I had a long journey of recovery and self-discovery ahead of me. But in that moment, I was too tired to think about the future. I just wanted to escape into sleep, if only for a few hours, to get away from the reality I had created for myself. The following days turned into a routine of cold, calculated actions. I buried myself in work, trying to drown out my feelings, but thoughts of Tiffany still found me at the most unexpected moments. I wondered what was happening to her now, but my pride and resentment prevented me from doing anything to find out. One evening, while sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey in hand, I received a message from one of my acquaintances. He had seen Tiffany at Honolulu Airport, trying to resolve issues with her flight. It seemed that my actions had borne fruit. Without her documents and phone, she was in a difficult situation. I didn't know whether I should feel satisfaction from this. After all, I had once loved this woman and had done everything to make her happy. But now, after everything that had happened, all I felt was bitterness and disappointment. Later, I learned that Tiffany eventually managed to return to the United States. She applied to the consulate for temporary documents and arranged for a flight back home. I imagined how she had to explain her situation, how she tried to gather her strength to overcome these difficulties. To some extent, I felt sorry for her, but I reminded myself that she deserved this. When Tiffany returned to Nevada, she encountered new problems. I had already frozen our joint bank accounts and changed the locks on the house. She tried to reach out to me, but I ignored her calls and messages. I saw her leaving voicemails where she asked for a meeting to discuss our situation, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to them. With each passing day, I became more withdrawn and distant. My friends and colleagues noticed this, but I didn't want to go into details. I simply mentioned that Tiffany and I were going through a rough patch and left it at that. A week after her return, I found out that Tiffany had to move in with her parents. This news reached me through mutual acquaintances. I should have felt satisfaction from her misfortunes, but instead I only felt emptiness. My revenge hadn't brought me relief. It had intensified my sense of loss. At night I lay in bed, contemplating the past and how things could have turned out differently. I realized that my life had changed forever, and I had to find a way to live with these changes. But on that night, I wasn't ready to think about the future. I simply lay in the darkness, immersed in my thoughts and feelings that continued to swirl in my head, finding no way out. Days passed monotonously, filled with work and gloomy reflections. I tried to avoid socializing with friends and colleagues, preferring solitude. My home, once full of warmth and laughter, now felt like a prison haunted by ghosts of the past. One day, scrolling through news on social media, I saw a photo of Tiffany. She was with Brandon. The photo was taken at some event, and both of them were smiling. Seeing them together, happy, was a blow to me. All the emotions I had tried to suppress resurfaced. I felt anger, betrayal, and pain. But most of all, I felt the need to take action. I closed social media and sat in deep contemplation. My thoughts revolved around one thing: revenge. I knew it wouldn't bring me relief, but I needed to do something to stop this pain. Spontaneously, under the influence of an instant impulse, I reached out to someone who could help me. It was an old acquaintance I had crossed paths with during my previous job. He had connections with people who could handle issues. I wasn't proud of this decision, but my anger and pain overpowered reason. We met in a deserted bar on the outskirts of town. I explained that I wanted Brandon to learn a lesson. I didn't want anything serious to happen to him, but I wanted him to remember this. A few days later, my acquaintance informed me that it was done. Brandon had been beaten in one of the quiet alleys of the city. I was told he would be left intact, but it would serve as a good lesson for him. When I learned of this, I expected to feel satisfaction, but instead I felt emptiness. I began to doubt my actions and my motives. Deep down, I knew that revenge would not bring me relief, but now that knowledge became even more tangible. Nights became worse for me. I suffered from insomnia, tossing and turning in bed, reflecting on the abyss I had plunged into. My life seemed shattered, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. With each passing day, I increasingly realized that vengeance had given me nothing but new guilt and shame. I began to contemplate what had transpired and understood that I needed to seek alternative ways to cope with my grief and disappointment. But for now, I was too immersed in my own turmoil to find a way out. The job that had once been my sanctuary and a source of pride now seemed meaningless. I continued to fulfill my duties, but my enthusiasm had disappeared. My colleagues noticed my lack of spirit and tried to support me, but I pushed away their care, preferring solitude. At home, I spent hours reminiscing about Tiffany and the happy moments we had shared. With each passing day, I became more aware that my revenge hadn't restored my past. It had only taken away the last remnants of my happiness. I tried to find a path to forgiveness, both for Tiffany and for myself, but the resentment and pain ran too deep. My nights were filled with insomnia and anxious thoughts. I agonized over what I could have done differently, how my life might have turned out if I had remained calm and shown more understanding. One morning, after another sleepless night, I realized I couldn't continue like this. I understood that my actions and my thirst for revenge had brought me nothing but additional pain and loneliness. I began contemplating the need to seek healing rather than destruction. My thoughts slowly turned towards the idea of therapy or counseling. I needed help to cope with these heavy emotions and find a way to move forward. I knew that I couldn't do it on my own, that I needed support to get through this challenging period in my life. That day marked the first step towards change. I made a few calls, searching for a psychotherapist who could assist me. I felt that it wouldn't be an easy path, but I was ready for it. I realized that I needed to learn to forgive, not just Tiffany, but also myself. I needed to find a way to reconcile with the past and learn to live again. That night, for the first time in a long while, I managed to get some sleep, even though my dreams were troubled, filled with images from the past. However, I felt like I had started moving forward. It wasn't like waking up. It was more like a slow, painful recovery after a long illness. But it was a beginning, the beginning of my journey to healing. My days acquired a new rhythm. Work, therapy sessions, long solitary walks. I reflected a lot on what had been and what could still be. I realized that seeking revenge against Brandon and taking actions against Tiffany had been a mistake. a way to express my pain and resentment, but they hadn't brought me any relief. Tiffany attempted to contact me several times, but I wasn't ready to talk to her. I didn't yet know if I could forgive her or if I even wanted to. I felt that before making a decision about our future, I needed to sort myself out. The divorce process continued. Legal matters demanded my attention, but I tried to approach it as a necessary formality. I understood that my life with Tiffany was over and I needed to move forward. One evening, sitting in my home, I realized that something vital was missing in my life. I began thinking about starting something new, perhaps a hobby or a new passion, something that would help me recover and find meaning again. I decided to start traveling. I've always enjoyed exploring new places, and I thought it might help me distract from past experiences and gain new impressions. I began planning my first trip, which I hoped would mark the beginning of a new chapter in my life. At the same time, I continued my sessions with the therapist. We discussed my feelings, fears, and hopes for the future. I began to understand that forgiveness is not only about Tiffany or Brandon, it's also about my relationship with myself. I started learning to forgive myself for my mistakes and wrong decisions. Every day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for growth and self-discovery. I realized that the road ahead would be tough, but I was prepared for it. I began to feel some hope for the future, hope that I could find peace and happiness again, even after everything that had happened. 3 months later, Tiffany and I officially divorced, and I felt relief. We didn't manage to talk because I didn't want to. She moved in with Brandon, and our shared home was sold. I contemplated forgiving Tiffany, but then I realized that she didn't deserve it. I was hurt that she continued her relationship while I was left alone. I switched to remote work, and my salary became lower, but it allowed me to leave the state and see the world. The house and all our shared property were sold and split in half. I didn't feel like a winner, but I knew I could start over. I couldn't even imagine that one vacation with my wife would change my life so dramatically. Thank you for listening to my story.
That's the end of the story. Write your opinion in the comments. Why do you think the main character eventually began to regret taking revenge on his abusers? Why did the wife decide to stay with her lover? Could the main character solve the whole situation peacefully? Why didn't the lover of the main character's wife write a statement against the main character? The main character realized that revenge did not give him anything good, but only aggravated his situation, and he began to succumb to remorse. The wife of the main character may have loved Brandon, but when he was poor, she decided to leave him and live with a rich guy. But when she met Brandon again, she realized that her feelings for him remained, and she decided to return to him. The main character could have done much smarter, but instead allowed his wife to finally return to her ex-boyfriend. The main character could not give in to emotions. Firstly, he could take everything on a phone camera and provide it as evidence in court, but instead resorted to illogical and destructive actions. The lover did not apply, most likely because he himself internally understood that he had made a mistake and destroyed someone else's marriage. But this is just a guess. It will be interesting to know your opinion on all these issues. In any case, we are glad that the main character found the strength and continued to live on. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. Good luck.